Hello, everyone. I'm Father Adrian Graffy. I'd like to welcome all of you, wherever you are in this country and beyond, to this very special live stream event on Let Us Dream, the Path to a Better Future. There it is, this little book produced by Pope Francis with the assistance of our speaker, Dr. Austen Ivereigh. This event comes at the end of a week which has seen us in Britain reach the tragic total of 100,000 deaths from coronavirus. And numbers all over the world continue to rise. So I'd just like to suggest we just spend a few moments in prayer and remember all those who have lost their lives to COVID-19. Thank you. I'm speaking to you from Gidea Park Parish on the borders of East London, and I have the pleasure to introduce my fellow parish priest from English Martyrs Horn Church, Father Brito Belevendran. Father Brito is the interfaith coordinator for the Diocese of Brentwood, which covers much of East London and the whole of the county of Essex. Many of our interfaith fellow citizens work in the health service and as carers and as frontline staff. And faith venues have been opening up as vaccination centres. We are mightily supported by people from other faith backgrounds. And Pope Francis talks in this little book also about the encounter with people from other faiths, encouraging understanding and harmony. So it's a pleasure to welcome Father Brito today and all our friends from other churches and from other faith communities. Dr. Austen Ivereigh is speaking to us from his home in Hereford, on the other side of the country. Austen is a fellow in contemporary church history at Campion Hall, Oxford. He has been a leader in Catholic Voices and in Citizens UK. He is a biographer of Pope Francis. His first book was published in 2015 called The Great Reformer, and in 2019, his second book, Wounded Shepherd. Obviously, he's very much trusted by Pope Francis, as this little book demonstrates. So Austen will speak to us now, and then we'll have a short break of about 10 minutes, and there will be time to consider the questions that have been sent in. And if you wish still to send a question, the email address, which is my email address, will come up on the screen. So ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are, it's my pleasure now to welcome Dr. Austen Ivereigh.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Father Adrian. It's lovely to have the opportunity to be with you all. I know many of you are from East London and Essex and Brentwood, some of you from other parts. Wherever you're calling in from, welcome. And I don't know what it's like where you are, but right here in Herefordshire, it is raining a lot. So it's a good day to be on a Zoom. But of course, whenever there's rain these days because of climate change, we also have the risk of floods. So we're waiting really to find out here whether the floods will be as bad as they were last year. I begin with this mention of floods because today is, if you looked at the gospel for today, it is rather strikingly, rather amazingly, the same gospel that Pope Francis took in March the 27th last year, when he gave that famous Urbi et Orbi address from St. Peter's Square. You may remember, that the square was empty and dark and rainy, and he famously began, by quoting Mark chapter 4, when evening had come, Yeah, it's the story, the gospel about the disciples with Jesus on the lake and the storm, and Jesus is asleep in the boat. But Francis began that famous meditation just in the context of lockdown, then just beginning. For weeks now, he said, it has been evening. Thick darkness has gathered over our squares, our streets, and our cities. It has taken over our lives, filling everything with a deafening silence and a distressing void that stops everything as it passes by. We feel it in the air. We notice in people's gestures, their glances, and so on. Very striking beginning, and then went on, of course, to help us to understand what this crisis, this coronavirus pandemic, was beginning to teach us. That his real message was that God was with us, that Jesus may look asleep in the boat, but he's there. And he began that night, I think, to be the Moses of our moment, to be the great guide to humanity. In this crisis, which I think he has become over the last year. And this is the context of the book that I want to talk to you about, Let Us Dream, which Father Adrian already held up. It came out at the beginning of December. It kept me extremely busy last summer, and it can be read in a sitting. It's not a long book, but it is pretty packed. It's a rather special book. Those of you, of course, who've already read it, I hope that what I am able to say to you today will help give you some of the keys and some of the background, some of the context to a better appreciation of the book. But I'm not going to assume that anybody has read it. So this is also an invitation to read it. In essence, Let Us Dream is giving spiritual guidance and wisdom for a world that is in crisis, that is in a dark night, but a world also that is on the threshold of a new era. This is Francis's deep conviction, is that we are on the threshold of change, that crises like these never leave humanity the same. Wars and plagues always change us. And the big question is, how is it going to change us? Are we going to be able to come out of this better, or will we slide back? Because progress is not automatic. And that's where his guidance comes in, because he's offering us, I think, in this book, a bit like being on a retreat. He's offering us the chance to open ourselves to the graces always on offer to us in times of tribulation from a God of love and mercy who walks with humanity. And that's really important. God is there. Jesus is asleep in the boat. But whether we're able to open our hearts and minds to receive those graces, to receive that guidance, to keep Jesus close, is an open question. And we need help. We need guidance. So Let Us Dream is about letting God into our story, into history, into this moment. And I think there are three firsts involved in the book, and I'll talk a bit more about how it sort of came together and so on, the context, in a minute. But just to say really that where the book came from, really it originated with that famous Urbi et Orbi on March the 27th. That was followed, he agreed to do an interview with me, which was published in the tablet on the eve of Easter last year. It also came out in Commonweal in the United States. And it was about, some of you may have read it, it was about 3,000 words of extraordinary insights that Francis clearly had into the pandemic. But it left me impatient to know more and to listen to him more. And over Easter, I was deeply struck, as I'm sure many of you were, by his homilies. And then shortly after Easter, we had the announcement, did we not, of the post-COVID commission in the Vatican, which is a new body that he created specifically to put the church at the heart of the reshaping of the post-COVID world, or at least the conversation about that post-COVID world, connecting the thinking of the church, Catholic social teaching, the Vatican, with some of the rethinking going on around the world about the crisis and what it has to teach us. So the first about this book, the first really extraordinary thing about the book is that this is the first book ever written by a pope in response to a specific crisis. So it's a papal book. You know, we've seen previous ones under previous popes. Pope John Paul II, you may remember, crossing the threshold of hope. Benedict, there were at least 2 interview books with Peter Seeveld. Francis himself has done 2 books before this. So when I say papal book, I mean when a pope sits down, usually with an interlocutor, a journalist, and gives his own personal views and understandings about what's happening in the world and in the church. And so this is the first time a book like this has been directed at a moment of a particular moment of crisis in humanity. The second first is it's the first to be drafted in both English and Spanish. And it was, both of these texts were produced as original texts last summer by me with a bit of help. As you can imagine, I had some help with producing the Spanish edition, but all my interactions with Francis were in Spanish. But in the process of drafting the book, it was really his idea that I should draft in English because he said, it's your mother tongue and it'll help. So my role in this book was to interview him, to send him questions, to receive his answers. This was all done remotely, by the way, because I was in lockdown here, he was in lockdown there. This was May, June, by the way, when we started to work on it. We finished it in August. So it's really throughout the summer, we were interacting, by email, by phone. And I was drafting and he would then work on the draft. But we had these 2 simultaneous texts. But he said, I think he thought that it would be important that that I worked on an English, that it was initially drafted in English. And one of the reasons for that was that I think he saw the book as a way of speaking particularly, perhaps to the English-speaking world at this time, because that's part of the world which hasn't heard from him quite so directly. Now, the fact that it was drafted in English is important because it meant that the text, the language of Pope Francis in this book is very natural. I joked with him, in fact, that he would be the most naturally English-sounding Pope since Adrian IV, who some of you may know was the only ever native English Pope, which he liked very much. But so he sounds natural, he sounds very accessible in English. But also in the Spanish edition, I was very keen for him to sound as he is, Argentinian. And for those of you who know Spanish, know that the Argentines have a particular way of speaking, and the people of Buenos Aires have a whole series of sort of idiolects and phrases typical of the porteños. And again, that was preserved, which is important because in most papal documents, he's turned into a kind of Castilian Spaniard because that's the convention of the Vatican. So I mentioned the language point really because it gives the book, it makes the Pope intimate and accessible and close in a way that perhaps he hasn't been heard before. And the third striking thing about the book is the fact that even though it is the result of conversations with me, and it says indeed in the title page, in very small writing, in conversation with Austen Ivereigh, you'll see that in very small writing. In fact, I don't appear in the book at all, except at the end in a postscript where I explain to the reader why I don't appear. And this is, again, another sort of remarkable thing about the book is that we felt in writing it, in putting it together, that there was simply no need for me to be there asking questions, that it was much better that the Pope could address the reader very directly. And what makes me very happy in the reception of the book is that people say it is a bit like having Francis with you, guiding you on a retreat, having your own, as it were, personal spiritual director. So there's, again, an intimacy, a proximity there, which I was sort of from a writerly point of view very pleased to have achieved, because I think that's where Francis is absolutely at his strongest. So the book was born out of a proposal I wrote to him in May last year, and I said that I was very struck by how at this time, everybody, most leaders seemed to say, we'll be changed by this crisis. And almost everybody had an opinion about how we should be changed by it. But he was unique among world leaders in being able to understand the process of conversion itself. That is to say, how we change. And I really went to him with that question. I said, I would love to do a book with you where you get the space to explain this big insight. You know, how is it that we allow God to become part of our story and our history? Why is it that certain crises change us for the better and others don't? You know, what is the whole business of being open to the grace of conversion? Anyway, he accepted, but he said to me, I'm going to need a lot of help from you, meaning I don't have time to sit down and write a book, which of course I understood. And so that's how we emerged. We developed this kind of modus operandi where he would feed me things, I would ask him for things, and then I would literally put the text together, and he would then work on the text. And the beautiful thing about working with him in those couple of months was that, you know, he gave me complete freedom and trust. He said in the first recording, he said, I'm going to just answer your questions. I'm going to speak. And if it's useful to you, use it. If you think the Pope is an old man who no longer makes any sense, just leave it on the cutting room floor. You know, he was very, very generous in his trust. But then on the other hand, when I had got the text, he really worked hard on it and made sure that it was the best possible text and absolutely reflected him and his thinking and his language. And so that's really, I think, what I learned about him in the course of working with him is well, just what a great person he is to work with, the way he gives you freedom and trust, but then does everything he can to ensure that you're successful. So the book is emerged from these exchanges, some of which also involved him pointing me to particular texts of his or articles, which of course, as his biographer, I'm pretty familiar with. So I have a lot of them here in my office, but also he shared with me certain texts which hadn't been made public before, which also were contributed to the book. So the book is made up of his response to my questions, as well as texts, both texts from his time as Pope and also from before. The title, just a word about the title, Let Us Dream. So the dream language has formed a strong part of Francis's discourse in the last couple of years in relation to fraternity. So you're familiar with the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which came out on October the 4th last year. And that was in turn the fruit of the document on human fraternity of February 2019 in Abu Dhabi, when the Pope met with a person with whom he has developed a very strong working relationship, Sheikh Al-Tayeb of the Al-Azhar Institute in Cairo, who's considered kind of the leading scholarly authority in the Sunni Muslim world. So the two of them worked, I think, for about 2 years on this document called the Document of Human Fraternity, which was a rallying cry to the world, and especially to people of good faith and religious people in particular, to work together in a new way in response to the world's crises, particularly at a time when religion was being caught up with national populism and being instrumentalized on the one hand by national populists, on the other by extremists, terrorists, and so on. So in this context, they issued the two representatives of the two great world's religions come together to make this great plea. Now, Francis, in talking about that document in his trips in 2019, referred to the document as, you know, he said, I've had a dream with a friend. This is my dream with a friend. And so dream language was he was using it a lot. So that's partly why the title has that. But also because the idea of a dream in the Bible, as you know, is the place where God makes his will known. The Holy Spirit enters in the form of an angel or in the form of voices or whatever. But, you know, prophets, people who are being called by Jesus, or of course with the Christmas story, Joseph asleep, God reveals his saving plan to Joseph. So why through dreams? Well, because dreams are the place. Dreaming is the place when we are unconscious, when we are defenseless, when what we normally rely on for mechanisms of truth and so on are not there. And so there's a new openness, one might say, in those moments, so that the dream is the place where God is able to speak to us. And a crisis is an appropriate time to dream, not because it's about trying to escape from a fearful reality, but rather to understand better what that reality is pointing to. In other words, what God is trying to tell us through that crisis. So it's a crisis is a time of clarification. It's a time of testing, which reveals what's in our heart. So in the prologue to Let Us Dream, right there on page 1, the Pope begins by saying, I see this as a time of reckoning. And he says, you know, he thinks of what Jesus tells Peter, that the devil wants him to be sifted like wheat. So right from the start of the book, we have this idea that this is a time where we need to choose, and that in a crisis, we reveal what's really in our heart, what is really our priority. I began by mentioning the floods, and you know, I live in a flood-prone area, as some of you may do, and naturally one thinks, okay, you know, you get phoned up and you're told you've got half an hour to leave your house. You know, what do you do? What do you take with you? Who do you call? What do you choose to do? You have a whole series of priorities around you have to choose. And of course, in making those choices, you reveal what's in your heart. So this crisis, this pandemic, reveals so much of what is in the heart of our society. It is a revealing time. Who runs from the challenge? Who faces it? Who goes out to serve others? Who retreats into themselves? It's a time of choices, and hence discernment, which really is one of the big themes of the book. So on page 3, Francis mentions, as of course he does at length in Fratelli Tutti, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And he says, in a crisis, our functionalism, as he calls it, is shaken loose. By functionalism, he means our tendency to resort to our own functions, our own roles and our own identities. So he says, in a crisis, all that is shaken loose, and we have to revise and we have to modify our roles and habits. A crisis always demands that our whole self be present. You can't retreat, pull back into old ways and roles. Think of the Samaritan, he said. He stops, he pulls up, he acts, he enters into the world of the wounded man. He throws himself into the situation and into another's suffering, and so creates a new future. So to act in a Samaritan way, he says, in a crisis means letting myself be struck by what I see, knowing that the suffering will change me. This is what it means as a Christian to take up the cross, to embrace the cross, to be willing, in other words, to suffer with others. And in that opening out to others and opening out indeed to God, we allow God, as it were, to dream in us. We open ourselves to a new future. So right there in the prologue, he sets out how the book is going to work. And the book is constructed in a very simple three-part structure: a time to see, a time to choose, and a time to act. And those of you familiar with the church's social engagement will know that this reflects the see, judge, act method, made famous by Catholic Action back in the 1920s, but very much taken by the Latin American church and used to read particular historical situations. So the idea of the book is it is a journey of conversion in the midst of a crisis that is structured around these three parts. And at the heart of the idea of the book is a quote from the poet Hölderlin, which he likes very much, which is very simple, little gnomic phrase almost: where the danger is, also grows the saving power. So precisely where the risk is, where the danger is, where we are threatened, there we find there is the grace, if you like, of the solution. Very, very important key idea in the book, that the crisis is in itself the passport to the change that we need. And he says, he says that's the genius in the human story. There's always a way to escape destruction. Where mankind has to act is precisely there. In the threat itself, that's where the door opens. This is a moment, he says, to dream big, to rethink our priorities, what we value, what we want, what we seek, and to commit to act in our daily life on what we have dreamt of. So in the first part, which is called A Time to See, it's really about how we need to look, how we need to see this crisis, with what lens. Forgive me for using theological language, but it's a hermeneutical question. How do we look at this crisis which we are now living in. And before giving some examples from the book, I was very struck. I know some of you may know Jose Pagola's book on Jesus, wonderful book called Jesus, an Historical Approximation. I was reading just the other day that his account of his chapter called Jesus, Prophet of the Reign of God. And he describes how Jesus begins his ministry, where Jesus chooses to go and be. And I was very struck in reading this, that this is exactly what Francis does in part 1 of the book. So I mean, we have Jesus, as it were, there's this urgency and drama, isn't there? And Jesus going out in a situation of oppression, in a situation of urgency, calling for change. But where does he choose to go? He chooses to go to the villages. He stays away from the big cities. He goes to the edges, to the margins of human existence, to places of human suffering, because it's from there that you're able to see better. So his focus is on, as is Francis in the first part of the book, on pain and suffering. Where is the pain at the moment in this crisis? Who is suffering in particular? And he cites many persecuted peoples, migrants in refugee camps, the poor in the shanty towns, the abandoned elderly. These are the places that Francis goes to in the first part of the book and asks us to focus on, because he said, pay attention, that's where Christ is speaking to us. So the periphery, and this of course comes, big theme of the book, change comes from the periphery. Change happens when the center opens itself to the periphery. So from the periphery comes, of course, the desire for change, because those who are most affected by the existing order, their suffering is what leads to the cry for help, the cry of pain, the desire for change. And so the poor, the lonely, the outcast, the migrant, the abandoned elderly are all knocking at the door. There's a demand or a call for integration. They're outside asking to be let in, the ill to be healed. So this process of integration of the periphery, which is a big theme of the book, it becomes more likely, or becomes a pressing question in a context of a crisis like this one, because of our experience of shared vulnerability. So the opportunity for fraternity lies precisely in the experience of shared vulnerability. This is what can or should lead to a greater fraternity. I mean, if you just look back on the effect of the world wars in the last century on our own societies, the way they served to break up, class distinctions, the way they led to this whole demand for integration, women's work, and better conditions. The society gets shaken up. And why? How is it shaken up? Well, it's people fighting on the front lines together, dying together, makes people, of course, helps them to overcome their barriers. So I mean, there's a time of testing, of purification in all of our lives. We're all familiar with storms or floods or whatever metaphor you want to use. We all have them in our lives when we're made jobless, when we experience divorce, when we experience grave illness, when everything we value is taken away from us. And it seems just an important, obvious, perhaps, point to make, but real change comes about in society when people are faced with an existential threat, a threat to their very existence. The threat of death is a very important catalyst for change. It gives the time and the questions that we face a new urgency and drama, because so much hangs on the choices that we make. And that's true when we look back on our lives. So it's true of us as individuals, but there are also times in history when we have a collective storm, a collective flood, a plague, a war, and so on, where that same effect is brought to bear on society as a whole. So it's a bit like, what I said earlier, you've got 20 minutes to get out of your house. What do you choose to save? Is the question now facing a society in which, for example, we have a large part of the economy has come to a halt. We have people being made unemployed on a massive scale, people suffering real hardship, hunger. How are we all going to respond? How is society going to respond? What's the existential choice? So Francis is helping us to navigate that choice by, first of all, inviting us to look around us and see where there is that pain and that suffering. How it is that what we see in that pain, what it is telling us about the way we organize ourselves, the way we have been going on. I was speaking to a very wealthy, very interesting businessman, a great investor, man who's made millions from investments. And he just said to me, he'd just read the book and he loved it. And he said, I just think that we were carrying on in a totally ridiculous, hedonistic way, He says, you know what, Austen? He says, I've just made my wealth has increased by 15% over the last year. But, and I've been at home, doing nothing, and my wealth has just increased. Why? Because I had investments in, in Zoom, in Amazon, in whatever. I've grown. He says, there are people who are going hungry. Something's wrong there. We knew, didn't we, that things were not right. There were multiple crises, as Francis points out, that we were facing: crises of inequality, crisis of climate change, the rise in violence, the breakdown of political, all kinds of crises we were actually living through, but we didn't have the strength, the consensus, the desire, the will to change them. But now with this challenge, with this breakdown, we are now suddenly faced with those choices. So a big part of this is to allow ourselves to be affected by what we see. And when we do that, and Francis is very clear that it's very easy to be overwhelmed in situations like this, to say, this is all too much for me to try to respond to or to resolve. But he says this is where faith comes in. So we are not alone, he says on page 20. That's why we need not to be afraid to go down into the dark nights of problems and suffering. We know that we don't have all the answers ready and neatly packaged, yet we trust that the Lord will open for us doors that we had no idea were there. And he says, of course, we hesitate, faced with all this suffering. We balk, we hesitate, we tremble a little. He says, all this is fine. Because in fact, when we face these amazing, overwhelming choices and challenges, it is precisely when we are overwhelmed, of course, that we are more likely to turn to God in prayer, to give time, to make space for those dreams, to listen to God. And he says, when we face choices and contradictions, asking what God's will is in these circumstances opens us to unexpected possibilities. I describe, he says, these new possibilities as overflow, because they often burst the banks of our thinking. Overflow happens when we humbly set before God the challenges we face and we ask for help. We call this discernment of spirits because it involves learning what is of God and what is seeking to frustrate his will. So here we have right there two big themes of the book. The question of overflow, that we believe, we know, we have faith in a God of abundant mercy, who loves us and cares for us, who is almost waiting for us to be vulnerable enough to call on him, to be able to overflow us with his mercy and with his love. So this will come back frequently in the book as a sign of where the Holy Spirit is present. And he describes this in part 2. He uses the Greek word, and I'm not a New Testament scholar, but periseo, which is the word that's used to describe, the father going out to embrace the prodigal son, or the wedding host of the wedding going out and seeking people as guests from the hedgerows and the roads. So it's that kind of that overflow of love and mercy that comes from the heart of God. This is how this is the contact we need to make in order for God to be part of our story. We need, as it were, to open ourselves to that overflow. And so he's asking ourselves in part 1 also to look around and see, well, where do we see those signs in the response to the pandemic from people? And of course, he naturally cites the doctors and the nurses who, I don't know whether you've seen any of Clive Myrie's reports on BBC, but you know exactly what I mean. Many of you may have had personal experience of the front line, the NHS front line in this crisis, the extraordinary self-giving of people in this context, and people who are willing to risk their lives, not stupidly, not because they're taking risks, but because there are risks involved for everybody who is trying to keep us all going in the middle of this crisis. So he asks us to focus on those people and say, well, yeah, they are pointing the way. That's what we need to look at. That's what we need to be guided by. So he also talks in part one very interestingly. He introduces the theme of dignity in quite an implicit way, but where he says, he talks about the abuse of power of conscience, and also sexual abuse, that these are all signs of a failure to respect human dignity. So a failure to respect limits. And he sees this as being, this is the corruption of our time that he sees, is the abuse of power. Those of you familiar with his teachings on the environment know he talks a lot about the technocratic paradigm, the idea that because we can, we're able to, because we're able to, somehow we should, that this sense of of unrestrained power. And he uses this I think in a very interesting way. He talks about the Black Lives Matter protest over the summer. He talks about the Me Too movement as an expression of people, as it were, reclaiming their dignity faced with this abuse. What interests me is, I think, the really interesting idea that he introduces in part one, which again becomes a big theme, is that mentality, that abusiveness, is itself an abandonment of the idea of life and the creation as a gift. So he says on page 30, if somebody who loves you gives you a beautiful and valuable gift, how do you handle it? To treat it with contempt is to treat the giver with contempt. If you value it, you admire it, you look after it, you don't disdain it, you respect it, you're grateful. And then he talks then about the ecological crisis. The damage to our planet stems from this loss of awareness of gratitude. We have grown used to owning, but too little to thanking. So at the heart of the corruption of the world that's been exposed by this crisis is a failure to thank, a failure to recognize what is a gift. So he has very interesting pages about his own ecological awakening. But then he says in relation to this, our sin lies in failing to recognize value, in wanting to possess and exploit that which we do not value as a gift. Sin, he says, always has this same root of possessiveness, of enrichment at the expense of other people and of creation itself. It's the same sinful mindset, he says, that we were just discussing in relation to abuse. So the sin is in exploiting what must not be exploited, in extracting wealth or power or satisfaction from where it should not be taken. Sin, he says, is a rejection of the limits that love requires. So we have at the heart of our crisis that's been exposed in this pandemic, an attitude towards God and towards creation, which of course treats gift as contempt. So the idea of value, we fail to value what is gift. We fail to understand the innate and intrinsic value and from which the human dignity flows. So the story underlying the book, and he gets to this really in part 3, is that we become aware of the gift of that we are and that creation is, that other people are, because of the closeness of God. This has been revealed to us in the closeness and the mercy of God. In rejecting God, in as it were, excluding that whole awareness, we fall into this exploitative, abusive mindset. We fail to respect human dignity. We fail to put value on what is intrinsically of value. So that in a crisis, what happens is that we awaken to that. We realize that we have not valued what is of value. And again, you can all relate to this, can't we, in our own lives? We've had crises or periods of crises where our lives are turned upside down, and we suddenly realize, we had been chasing illusions. We had been valuing things that were not of value. More importantly, we've been failing to assign value to that which we had been given. And that leads us then to a whole new attitude to want to cherish and to respect. So that is the heart of the argument of the book, and there's much else in part one that's really worthy of comment, and a lot of which has been picked up in the press. But I've chosen to focus on what I regard as the heart of the argument or the idea of the book, to help you perhaps grasp some of the deeper purposes of it. So I'm going to stop here for the first part of the talk. And I'm going to come back in the second part to talk about two really meaty things in the book, in part two and in part three, related to synodality and what it means to awaken to the people's dignity. Let's dig in now into a couple of two or three big themes in the book in parts 2 and 3 of Livestream. So I explained that it's constructed on this three-part dynamic: a time to see, a time to choose, and a time to act. So time to choose is the longest part of the book, and it gets quite it digs very deep, and I had to sometimes reassure my editors in New York that that this was important stuff, and it's some of it's very complex, but it needs to be said. What Francis is doing in part 2 is himself discerning the signs of the times, and he's also teaching us how to do the same. I've already said that one of the analogies I've used for Francis in this book is he's the spiritual director of humanity, guiding them through a retreat, helping to open them to the graces on offer at this time. Another analogy would be that the Pope is acting here as a kind of prophet, a prophet in the Old Testament sense of writers who had seen the deepest plans of God in dreams and in visions, and wanting to communicate that. I think more actually the title of the book, Let Us Dream, Francis is inviting us into that same process of discernment and dreaming, which is the role that he's undertaken. The message of the Old Testament prophets was always, of course, that the world had become corrupted, that there had been an original foundational contract or covenant, an original time from which people had forgotten and turned in on themselves, and the world had become corrupted, and that even creation itself had become contaminated, that there's this battle between light and darkness then for God, in other words, to reign again, for the kingdom of God to come again. And the sign of the kingdom of God's coming is that the oppression of the people, what dehumanizes us, what holds us down, is being countermanded by forces, by spirits, by movements of the spirit, which are of God, which are seeking to set us free, to rehumanize us, to enable us to live according to dignity. And of course, a big part of Jesus's message is the reign of God is already here among us. The Spirit's already moving in this attempt to reclaim that dignity. And that God's coming is known by the signs of, which Jesus constantly uses, the signs of healing and caring. And Francis is doing this a lot in part 2. He's saying, where is it that we see the signs of God's coming now among us in this crisis? And he talks very interestingly, he has a section on the abandonment of the elderly. What does it tell us that so many old people have died in this crisis, and that how the virus has torn through elderly care homes, which of course have been exposed as places where the carers have been paid very little, and that these elderly people have often been abandoned. Of course, the tragedy is elderly people haven't been able to be visited by their relatives, but in ordinary times, how many elderly people simply are never visited? So this is one of the signs of the times. He says, this is how God works in crises. It's showing up what needs to change. But another area that he says he sees the sign of the Spirit moving is in the leading role of women. And he has quite a long section on women, on the leadership of women in this crisis and in the church, which has attracted a fair amount of press attention and discussion so far. The way he reads the signs of the times is he says, look at how women have been affected by this crisis. They've been on the front line of the crisis, in the sense that they are mostly the ones who work in the health sector, but they're also the ones who've borne the brunt of the crisis because their work has, they don't have the kinds of protections, that many workers have because they're working in a more informal sector, and so on. But he also says, look at the resilience of women as well. Look at women leaders. He doesn't mention them by name, but we all know that, Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, Angela Merkel and so on, that women actually have responded extremely well as leaders to this pandemic, in many cases, much better than men. So anyway, he says, let's look at all this, and what does this sign invite us to think about? What might be the Spirit of God, what might be the Spirit saying to us? And he talks about that moment in the Easter story when, of course, it's the women who aren't paralyzed by the death of Jesus, but rather they're distraught, but they're not paralyzed, so that when they go to the tomb to anoint him, they are the ones who are present. They are the first witnesses of the resurrection. And he then turns to, he says he's thinking particularly of women economists at this time, whose fresh thinking is especially relevant for the crisis. And he mentions two women in particular, whose books I normally wave around, but I don't have them. One of them is here. Both interestingly in England. This is one of them called Kate Raworth, who's got a book called Donut Economics. And this is all about how we can have an economy that serves the poor, integrates the poor, and also protects and regenerates the planet. On a more sophisticated level, he also cites Mariana Mazzucato. I say sophisticated because Mazzucato is much more of a kind of traditional type of economist. Mariana Mazzucato is American, works in London, works out of UCL in London. And interestingly, I've just got the tablet for this week. She's on the cover of this week's tablet, Capitalism Isn't Working, economist praised by the Pope. Interesting article, interesting introduction actually to her thinking, which is that capitalism has to be reinvented. It has to be rethought in order to deliver on the goals that actually we need. And her book, the book that Francis cites in Let Us Dream, is called The Value of Everything. And it's actually all about price and value. It's the way we've ended up thinking that only that which has price has value. And of course, I began, didn't I, in the first talk by talking about how this crisis has exposed our values, meaning what it is that we value. So Francis is saying here, the call of these economists for an overhaul of the models we use to manage economies is attracting attention, he says, which is true because they're very much being talked about at the moment. These are not just these two, but many of them, and many of them are women, interestingly. Theirs is a perspective, he says, born of the practical experience of the real economy, which they say has opened their eyes to the inadequacy of standard textbook economics. It was often their unpaid or informal work, their experience of maternity or running households in addition to high-level academic work, that made them aware of the flaws of the dominant economic models of at least the last 70 years. And he goes on to say, look, I know that these women are all different, they might disagree with each other, but he sees it as significant that they are women. He says what he sees here is ideas formed from their experience in the periphery. So there's a good example of where the experience of the periphery helps to clarify what needs to change. Yeah? So because they are women, they'd be much more exposed, as it were, to that periphery. So one thinks particularly, and this is obvious, isn't it, to any of us, that women are often the ones who are caring for people unpaid, often the people who are sustaining our communities. But again, they're not paid. And so therefore we tend not to, or they're paid very small amounts, in which case we tend not to think of them, therefore, as important. But actually this crisis, as Francis says, has helped us to see actually, well, who really matters to us in this crisis are not the people who are paid huge amounts of money. I mean, the celebrities are pretty useless in this crisis, as well as indeed one thinks, all these businesses which are frankly paralyzed and these great entrepreneurs, well, what use are they to us now? Who's actually keeping us going? It's the supermarket shelf stackers, it's the nurses, it's the people in the care sector and so on. So what he uses is this idea of an economy of care, a culture of care, which is something he's been talking about a lot, in contrast to what he would call a kind of sacrificial mentality. So the culture of encounter versus the culture of sacrifice. The culture of sacrifice being a culture based on power, on growth, on individual supremacy. So this is the discernment which Francis is inviting us to enter into in part 2. And it contains, part 2 also, a very interesting critique of the current political models on offer, whether liberal technocratic individualism, for want of another word, or authoritarian populism. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute when I'm talking about part 3. But he's really starting off in part 2. So actually, if you, with our discerning hat on, so what has become clear, where are the spirits moving? It is clear that the pressing issues that are facing humanity right now in this crisis, and more broadly in the other crises which this crisis has revealed, that our politics is incapable of responding to it, or incapable of responding to it as it should be responded to. So we're talking about here a breakdown in governance, a breakdown in political culture, a breakdown in economic understanding. You know, our models, in other words, are broken. So this is Francis, of course, is not the only one saying this. It's become very common in this crisis to talk about the need to rethink. But Francis is here saying, well, okay, but what are the spirits saying behind all this? And he's pointing to where he thinks the good spirit is calling us, which is in this, as it were, culture of care, which is at the moment questioning current economic models. So that's really the first part of part 2. Now, in the latter part of part 2, he gets into the whole question of synodality, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because some of it gets very complex, and you really need to read it. It's I think probably arguably the most important part of the book, where the Pope is really revealing, I think to an extent that more than any Pope ever has before, what it means to have to govern the Church obedient to the Holy Spirit. And we know that that's what popes do, but he's showing us in this second half what that means in practice. And he does it through this, the idea of synodality. Synods which under Francis have become reinvigorated, one might say reformed, made over. There's been a makeover of the synods in Rome, which you'll be familiar with from my books if you've read them. I mean, in Wounded Shepherd, I go into great detail about this, and particularly the Family Synod of 2014-2015. But what we're really dealing with here is that the Synod has emerged under Francis as a mechanism of ecclesial discernment, as a mechanism, in other words, of making known or discovering God's will for the Church through gathering, discussion, debate, often very fierce debate over questions which divide us. But at the heart of it is not a parliamentary kind of process where one party is seeking to win the argument against the other. In fact, it's not about winning arguments at all. It's about holding together things in tension, disagreements in tension, and allowing the Holy Spirit to create from that tension that's held together something new. And this, again, he returns to the idea of the overflow as being the sign of that. So synodality as a search for the will of God, which is the task not just of individuals, but of groups. So this is what the Jesuits call apostolic communitarian discernment, where the group itself becomes the subject of the act of discernment. And that it's basically consultative in the sense that the superior, in this case the Pope, is the one who makes those final decisions. It's his task to discern what it is the Spirit is saying. But on the way there is this process of weighing different aspects of the question, not just on a rational level, but using the rules for discernment. You know, where is the Spirit present here? How is the Spirit disguising itself? How is the bad spirit disguising itself as an angel of light? And so on. And this is very important in the Church, because in the Church, whenever we have disagreements, people always appeal to tradition, the gospel, Jesus, you know, and so on. Everybody, in other words, is on the side of the good. Well, we need discernment to work out what's really going on. Why does all this matter? Because, as he says in the book, and as he says more explicitly still in Fratelli Tutti, we live in a profoundly divided society. Our divisions have become not just polarizations, but paralyzing polarizations to the point where we're incapable of moving ahead. And this is true of our church, it's true of our society, because of these profound divisions which have caused us to gather under banners and flags and form around parties, and we're all now engaged in these battles for over truth. So what Francis is doing in part two, I think, is of huge importance to this particular historical moment. He is laying out a process, a mechanism, a dynamism, whatever you want to call it, of gathering together, of walking together, which is what synodos means, of being able to have differences and respect those differences, not try to change people, not try to win arguments, but rather to be held together on a journey, which then allows us to overcome the limitations of our own particular viewpoint and to see the bigger truth beyond. So there's an explanation of that here, which I think is compelling, it's clear, it's really, really worth digging into. Because as he says, and he has said in the past, for the church to develop these mechanisms of synodality is not just for the sake of the church, but for the sake of humanity. The church is a complexio oppositorum. It is a place where different views can be reconciled. Because the Holy Spirit can be brought into the picture, we can have a reconciled diversity, and that's how we know that the Holy Spirit is present. Because this is not about uniformity, but nor is it about simply everybody having their own view, a kind of relativistic view. It's about holding together things in tension. It's a tense space to allow something new to emerge. And he uses the expression overflow again as a sign. He talks about the synods and how he, as it were, his own reading of the synods, how he knows that the Holy Spirit was present, and how difficult that is in a context of polarization, when everybody wants to reduce things to black and white, yes or no, this party, that party. So fascinating part two. But I also want to urge you, earlier in part two, before he gets onto all of that, he talks about something called the isolated conscience, which is a spiritual state of withdrawal from the body meaning the body of people, the institution. In this case, he's talking about the church, but it's true of any body, that is the spiritual state of withdrawal, where we cling to things that we don't want to let go of, and we start to build and we start to accuse others. We develop an attitude of suspicion and supposition. And I think so much of this explains, in the isolated conscience, explains so much of the resistance to Francis. I can come back to this later, but it's all very clearly laid out in the book that so much of what we see as ideological argument is really behind that is a spiritual state of withdrawal and into a sort of elitist. It's a state of both victimhood and sense of superiority, which I think we can recognize from a lot of what's been happening in the church, and indeed what's been happening politically in the US recently. So there's so much there about how we create unity, how we create fraternity, how we enable unity in spite of differences, how we can navigate conflict, avoiding the mimetic contagion of polarization, which is the place where the bad spirit is seeking to undermine the unifying spirit of God, but at the same time not running away from conflict. The task here is not to avoid conflict, but rather to enter into the divisions, the differences, to allow for new thinking that enables those divisions and those differences to become fruitful rather than sources of conflict. In part three, which is called A Time to Act, we move into the consequences of the discernment, the clarification that we've had in the first two parts. And it's really in Time to Act, Francis lays out his own vision of the rethinking of politics. And it's an extremely important chapter because it brings us into the depths of his own thinking about the people. Now, and the politics of the people. In Fratelli Tutti, he has a very powerful critique of populism. And what I said to him, because I saw he shared with me Fratelli Tutti, an earlier draft, And I saw his critique there of populism, where he says that populism seeks to instrumentalize the people rather than really give them a place at the table, rather than enable the people to be protagonists. And I said, can we explore that idea? Because it just seemed to me it needed to be really developed. And so he has in part 3, and I said to him also, we've got to start by what is the people? You know, the people means so many different things in different cultural contexts, right? It has connotations of fascism in some countries. It's a sort of rather wet and weak word in some others. It means a nation in other. So he begins with an explanation of how a people comes into being, how a people is formed. And of course, it's a very religious understanding of the formation of a people. You know, it's the awareness of God's closeness, the awakening to our shared dignity, and then the common struggle that flows from that awareness. That's how the people, as it were, is formed. So his big idea in part 3 is that the crisis that this crisis has exposed is the loss of the sense of the dignity of the people. Now, it's a very important and interesting insight, and I very much kind of want to see this as part of the conversation about the post-COVID era, but perhaps it's too big an idea really for many people to grasp, get hold of. But what we have here is a strong laying out the consequences of what it means to have a politics that puts the dignity of the people at its heart. He spoke in the end of part 1. He said, this crisis reminds me, the awakening of the dignity of the people reminds me of the book of Nehemiah, the first 8 chapters, which is about the story of the people of Jerusalem effectively taking charge of their own destiny. And this is what he sees happening at the moment in the world. And he sees the crisis of politics, the crisis of the economy, and he sees the renewal as coming from, guess where? The margins, the periphery, in what he calls the people's movements. Now, these are not what we would call social movements. They're more what we would understand as broad-based community organizing. That is to say, ordinary people organized in institutions of the grassroots and of the community, where those people are seeking access to the basic goods of human life. So he expresses them here as land, labor, and lodging. But we all understand what that means: a living wage, decent housing, decent schooling, safe streets, enough food to lead a healthy life, and so on. So the basic ingredients, as it were, of a healthy, dignified human existence, where people are organizing to gain access to that, Francis sees as a sign of the, as it were, of the spirit moving, and that the real change will come about when the center, and that includes, by the way, the church as a center, opens itself to what these movements are asking for, and as it were, enabling them. So it's an account of politics, or an account of social action, which puts a lot of store by and a lot of faith in these, what he calls people's movements. In Spanish, the term is movimientos populares. And there is a slightly kind of different connotation. One of my challenges in this book was to how to translate some of this stuff, because there are different connotations. And I went for people's movements rather than popular movements, which it seems to me we're not quite sure what those mean. And one of the interesting things I think in part 3 is how this differs from the kind of popular movement, if you like, which stormed the Capitol on January the 6th in the United States, which is definitely not a people's movement. Right? And you may say, well, what is the difference? How does he define that? And I just want to point you to a page, if I can just quickly find it. Where he's talking about where he became aware. I asked him, I said, where does this faith you have in these people's movements come from? And he talked about his role in Buenos Aires as Archbishop, when he organized Mass in the Plaza Constitución, one of the main squares, big, huge square in Buenos Aires, where he began, over many years, he organized a Mass every year for people on the margins, people who had been trafficked, prostitutes, but also the cartoneros, the cardboard collectors or recyclers, very, very poor people who many of whom became unemployed as a result of the 2001 crisis, and who earned a living by collecting cardboard for recycling at night, which they would haul in these huge kind of ton bags through the streets at night. And they began to organize, and Francis was deeply impressed by them and describes in the book how he used to go out at night with them to get to know them better. And so there's some wonderful passages there, and he just talks about the cartoneros in particular. But he says, what I saw in the people that gathered in Constitucion Square, this is on page 124, was the crowd that followed Jesus. They were dignified and they were organized. They carried with them the dignity that God's closeness had revealed to them. And he returns to this later when he says, they were not like, I met a crowd that reminded me of the crowd, the ordinary people who would stay for hours listening to Jesus until evening fell and they didn't know what to do. The crowd that followed Jesus was not a mass of individuals hypnotized by some deft orator, but a people with a history, with a hope, who safeguarded a promise. And he goes on to explain what he means by that. The people always hold, he says, in their hearts a promise, an invitation that leads them towards what they desire, despite the exclusion they suffer. Jesus' preaching evoked in them ancient promises they carried in their guts, in their blood, an ancestral awareness of God's closeness and of their own dignity. By bringing to them that closeness in the way he spoke and touched and healed, Jesus showed that awareness was real. He opened for them a path of hope into the future, a path of liberation that was not merely political, but something more, a human liberation that conferred that dignity that only the Lord can give us. That's why they followed Jesus. He gave them dignity. For Jesus, every person is capable of dignity and has value. Jesus restores the true worth of each person and of the people as a whole, because he can see with God's eyes. God saw that it was good, he says, quoting Genesis. Now, and that's when he talks about the cartoneros, the popular movements meeting in Rome. He talks about the desire for access to land, labor, and lodging, and he deals with a lot of the consequences of that. But very interestingly, what he says about the people's movements is, he says, this is why I've wanted to support them, why I've accompanied them. And he says, I would like every diocese in the world to be open to these movements. Some, of course, already are, he says, but I would like every diocese in the world to be open to these movements. As I said the other morning, when I was addressing a group of community organizing people, this is the first time a pope has ever so clearly and spoken about the importance of this kind of politics, broad-based community organizing, and given it such a strong endorsement. And I think that's partly the fruit of this time that he sees. He sees that politics is dividing in this way. Capitalism has become extremely problematic, and that really the hope is now in from below in these popular movements, and that the church needs to be there because that's where the church was born. He says the church was born here in the margins, in the shadow of the crucified. For the church to forget the poor would be the greatest scandal of all. So he then talks about various implications of this and things that he believes that we should be talking about and considering at the moment. And one of them, interestingly, is the universal basic income, which is something that both of these economists I mentioned have talked about. Many other economists have been talking about in recent years, which is the idea that everybody should receive some, sometimes called it's a citizen's income, a small but nonetheless sufficient amount each month. Everybody would get it, would be universal, which would then allow people, but of course you wouldn't get any tax break on anything you earned, everything you earned would be taxed, but it would allow people to work for the community, for example, some of the time. But actually it would be about giving more people access to work. That's how he sees it. He's not saying, this is Catholic teaching or anything. He's saying we should be discussing it. It's the kind of thing we should be discussing because it reflects the kinds of rethinking that we need at this time. And he talks about the importance of making the integration of the poor That's to say, enabling provision, enabling access to work, to dignified housing. This should be the central goal of the economy. The goal of the economy is not growth, it's not consumption. The central goal of the economy must be to provide this dignified life for all, while at the same time protecting and regenerating the planet, the environment, the natural world. So we end up with Francis in part 3 with Francis's vision for how this world, this crisis, could shake us out into new kinds of thinking that would enable us to embrace the very thing which we've forgotten, which has brought about the crisis in the first place. He ends with an epilogue, which is a very sort of sweet and very personal appeal to all of us to say, well, if you've been touched by anything here, very good Jesuit discernment, spiritual director kind of question, if there's anything here that's inflamed your heart, that's touched you, maybe you should act on it. Maybe you should go down to your nearest, ecological regeneration center or migrant welcome center or wherever, and just offer yourself. Say, look, I don't know what you do, but can I help? So inviting us to go out, to transcend and to decenter, as he puts it. And he ends with this poem by a Cuban who lives in Miami, who's a very interesting guy who I got to know as a result of this book. He's a comedian, in fact, in Miami. A lovely guy, but he does these poems, and he's not, I wouldn't call him a kind of great poet, but he has this tremendous ability with his poetry to sort of capture a moment. And this poem is called Hope, Esperanza in Spanish. When the storm has passed and the roads are tamed and we're the survivors of a collective shipwreck. With tearful heart and our destiny blessed, we will feel joy simply for being alive. And we'll give a hug to the first stranger and praise our good luck that we kept a friend, and so on. It's actually about waking up from this crisis. It's about getting through the storm, emerging on the other side. It's about what we've learned. It's about the changed consciousness which comes about by this shared experience of suffering that we've been through. And I was reminded when I read the poem, and when Francis told me, he would very much like this poem, he very much wanted this poem at the end of the book. I was reminded of that, of a famous passage in a book by Alessandro Manzoni called The Betrothed, I Promessi Sposi, which Francis has talked about a lot as being a big book in his childhood. This great Italian classic called The Betrothed, 19th century classic. And he mentioned, in fact, in our interview at the Tablet, he talked quite a lot about it. And there's this moment in the book where there's a place called the Lazzaretto. So the novel is set with the background of the plague of Milan of the 17th century, 1640s, I think it was. Absolutely devastating plague. I think it ultimately killed 2/3 of the population of Milan. And the characters in the story, the drama develops against the background of this. But it kind of ends up in the end of the book in this place called the Lazzaretto, which is a sort of field hospital. Now, Francis has often spoken, hasn't he, about the church as a field hospital. And I'm convinced that he had in mind, when he speaks about a field hospital, the Lazzaretto. It was a place where the plague, those who had the plague were brought. And to get them, of course, away from our people, to isolate them. And the people that tended them there are these selfless, heroic Franciscan friars, the equivalent of what would be some of our NHS workers today. The passage is a moment where a famous Franciscan friar called Father Felice is addressing a group of people who have survived the plague. And these are rather special people. They're a bit like the first people to get the vaccinations in our societies. They're the people who can now go out. And Father Felice is addressing them and kind of saying, God has spared you. You have been spared from this, from fate. And what is it that you should now be thinking? And he says to them, why did he make that choice, my children? The friar addresses the people here. Was it not to keep for himself a small nation chastened by affliction and fired by gratitude? Was it not to make us feel more keenly that this life is a gift of his hands, to be cherished as a thing given by him, to be used in works which we can offer up to him? Was it not so that the memory of our own sufferings might make us compassionate and helpful to our neighbours? And he says that, God forbid that those who should see in us a noisy gaiety, an earthly rejoicing at having escaped from that death with which they are still wrestling, talking about other people who have the plague. Let them see us rather go forth thanking God for our safety and praying God that they too may be saved. Let them say to themselves, even when they are outside, those people will not forget us and will still pray for us. And then he ends by saying, let's begin from here a new life, a new way of thinking. Let those of us who have got back all their strength give a brotherly arm to the weak. Let the young help the old. You who have lost your children, see how many children around you have lost their fathers. Take the place of those lost parents. And as your charity cancels out your sins, so it will soften your grief. I end there because I think the message that Francis has at the end of this book is that this plague, which has afflicted us, which continues to afflict us, will change us. It must chasten us. It must transform us and transform our hearts and our minds. And if we allow it to do that, then we can create a better future for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Austen. That's given us plenty of food for thought, and I think, told us just about how much precious material is found in this little book. It's the fruit of a lifetime of experience and reflection, and the fact that you were able to be the catalyst for getting that out to the world. Congratulations to you. Perhaps I could ask Father Brito, have you got any reaction you want to give to anything that Austen has said?
Yes, of course. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. First of all, it's really an honor to listen to you, Austen. Father Adrian is a scripture scholar and he knows all about primary source and secondary source. So we have you as our primary source, so close to the Holy Father in having brought out this wonderful vision. I just wish to share some of my own reflections based on your book, also books of Pope Francis and this morning's talk. Let me go straight away into the first point. In this entire book, I see that the Holy Father uses a language which is universal and not simply be of any group. He's not using a doctrinal language. He's not using a kind of a language that only a few can understand, but he's using a powerful language of the image. So the transforming power of the imaginal world is being brought out by him so beautifully. For example, Fratelli Tutti would speak of dark clouds over a closed world. And then he speaks of we have more than one pandemic, the pandemic of the inequality, social justice, and racial divide. I'm just trying to focus on the use of the imaginal world. Pope Francis points that there is a dawning of hope on the horizon, a glimmer of light and a chance to create a better, fairer world. In your own epilogue, or in his epilogue, Let Us Dream, we hear about that this is the time of pilgrimages. And we have the image of a pilgrim with decentering and transcending, with the image of a labyrinth, which is absolutely fantastic to know the current state of the church and the need to go beyond the logic of the labyrinth to decenter and to transcend. And I really like that image of the twitch upon the thread. Possibly this morning is the twitch upon the thread for all of us. And I liked what the best image that you gave on this topic of the imaginal is what you wrote. COVID-19 gave the Pope the mission to storm pilot, leading God's people through the tempest to a new horizon of possibility. The second theme that emerges for me in all these is a psychological methodology. Though there is no explicit mention, but the intense amount of a psychological moment is absolutely clear. The threshold moment that he speaks about leads me to think of what cultural anthropologists would always call the rite of passage. Indeed, this COVID is a rite of passage for the world. And a theme that strikes me is also the emergence of charismatic leadership. And in any form, any dynamic of understanding charismatic leadership, we have a crisis, we have a desperation, someone becomes creative and has a vision, and his vision or his dreams bring healing. This is common to so many of the myths and so many of the models in other cultures, in folklore and so on. And that entire narrative I could apply to this wonderful Holy Fathers and your fruit of labor. And the fourth point is the theology of the people of God. As I'm hearing you, I am aware that for 20 years, I've been living in a kind of a theological wasteland, and I'm bold enough to say that. Oftentimes, I used to feel quite alienated. That's because I've not been able to be in touch with the theology with which I was brought about in India. So here I would like to pay honor to Asian theologies, to African theologies, where the word subaltern is very important. And subaltern theologies have emerged, and the entirety of his narrative and discourse on having people as the center, especially the marginalized and those who are at the peripheries, all of them point to the wonderful theology that have emerged in different parts of the world. Of course, my first salute go to Latin American theology, Aparecida, Document, and so on, where the church has evolved a framework of theology, a hermeneutic that is based on people and its problems. Mention also should be used on the folkloric language and the poetic metaphors. The last but not the least, I find there is an enlightened approach here. And this is where my own understanding of interfaith comes in. Especially in different cultures, we have different approaches to problems. And enlightenment has been the quest of lots of other religions too. And therefore, in your postscript, you state that what is central to the papacy of Pope Francis are two things: unity in action and catalyzing the awareness of the people of God. So I'm really touched by the binary conflicts and confrontation that is being talked about, by reference to Guardini, who mentions contrapositions rather than contradictions. And I myself am inspired by that great conciliar virtue, grace of unity, borrowed from Karl Rahner. And most other tradition would speak of the unity of opposites, and this is common to not only other religions, but also to depth psychology and so on. So the Pope, it brings together such an enlightened approach of not being polarized, but being together in holding this tension together. I think that speaks volumes on the wisdom that we need. And also you speak of catalyzing the awareness of the people of God, the theology of the people of God. So these are some of the inspirations I draw, and I wish to thank you really for giving us this beautiful book along with the Holy Father, for your earlier works on the great reformer and the wounded shepherd. And I wish to conclude with that beautiful statement of yours. Pope Francis is the man with the vision and mission to show us the horizon we are yet to see. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Bruto. Thank you.
Would you like to say anything at this point?
Well, no, I very much welcome everything that Father Bruto said. I mean, I agree with you very much. I think the language that he uses is it's human language. It's the language of image, of storytelling, just like Jesus, right? Jesus comes not to pronounce a doctrine, but to awaken an awareness of reality. I think the psychological, there's a lot in the book which I agree has a lot of parallels with psychology. I mean, the grace, the Jesuits talk about the grace of interruption. And I think most psychologists would say that there is, you would talk about the same thing, these, as you say, rites of passage or catalyzing moments, which become opportunities for change. And the theology of the people of God, absolutely. I mean, there's so much in the book which I think that comes out of the deep heart of the Argentine pastor that was Bergoglio, who was very much the fruit of, as I explore in my books, the fruit of this particular branch or understanding of the liberation theologies which emerged in Latin America in the 1970s, but which parted and departed from liberation theology over the use of social science and Marxist hermeneutics. So that for Bergoglio and for the people theologians, I mean, Bergoglio was never really a theologian as such, But for the historians and the theologians who were part of that, the story of salvation is to be found in the history and the culture of the people. So history is the concrete play, as the locus of the encounter with God. So that, and I think so much comes from the history of the colonial history of Latin America, when the church is poor and missionary and close to the people and defends the people against, you know, the centers of power, which is a very different understanding that most people have of the church and the conquest. I mean, the conquest of Latin America is a very tragic period, but then we get these long 300 years of the colonial period, which, you know, in many ways, you look at the way the church was then, very similar to how the church is now in, you know, in India, in Asia, in Latin America, you know, close to the people, identified fundamentally with the people. And so there is a huge implication of that theologically and everything else. So I'm very grateful to you for bringing that out. And then lastly, Aparecida, you know, I've said often that the basis of this pontificate is the document of Aparecida, which was the discernment of the Latin American bishops in 2007, when they met for the first time in 25 years. And they did this kind of see, judge, act discernment of the reality of the moment in Latin America. And I've sort of insisted, and I've never been contradicted, that it was the most far-reaching and insightful reading of modernity, and above all of the difficulties that the church had in evangelizing modernity, of the church of anywhere in the world. And I think it has not been equaled since. And I think Aparecida will be the basis for the next papacy as well. I think it's defining this new era that we're in, but that's a whole nother topic. But I'm grateful for your comments. Thank you.
Okay, can I just, I've got a couple of questions, but one that I would like to ask you is that Pope Francis at a certain point says he can see a lot of digging in, putting a bit of varnish on the future, touching up the paintwork.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a challenge. Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think he's right, isn't he? I mean, so much of our politics at the moment is about how do we get through this crisis so that we can go back to what we were doing. And look, you know, this is the normal reaction of the centre. I mean, the centre does not welcome change. The centre does very well out of how things were. So, you know, the political centre, the financial centre, you know, this is all very difficult and troublesome. How can we go back to what we were doing is the question. So, of course, you know, there's talk about changes and reforms, but ultimately the mentality is, how do we go back? And that's what Francis is saying in the book, that we cannot do, because you cannot go back from here. You know, history has moved on. The crisis has already changed us, and it has awoken forces, it has awoken dreams, aspirations, whatever, that we can't, that door has been opened and it can't be shut. And so he sees, I sense from the book very little optimism about current political and economic thinking and leadership. I see very little confidence that he has in that. And that's why I think it's very interesting that he puts the emphasis elsewhere. And I think that probably comes from his own reading of history, that actually the centre usually doesn't open itself to the periphery until it has to. And then you get this, you know, this interesting dynamic. So yeah, I agree. He's not optimistic, but he is deeply hopeful.
Perhaps the present issue about vaccination and having to vaccinate everybody for anybody to be safe is a bit of a trigger. Could I just, perhaps as a last question, could you say something about the fascinating idea of integral ecology, which is mentioned in the book?
Sure. I mean, integral ecology is an expression that he uses in Laudato Si, and which is his 2015 encyclical, which he says in this book, and he said it elsewhere, is not a green encyclical. It's not an ecological encyclical. It's a social encyclical, meaning it's an encyclical, it's teaching about the way we have organized our society, our economy, and our politics. But of course, it has a particular emphasis on the environmental question, because the climate change and the current environmental crisis is the lens. Again, it's a bit like the pandemic. It has revealed what's really going on. So An integral ecology is an ecology which understands that there is a connectedness of ourselves with God, ourselves with creation, ourselves with each other, and that the solution to our social and our economic and our political and our environmental questions, is one. And that's what he's doing really in Let Us Dream as well, when he says that it's the same mentality which justifies the destruction of the rainforest, also, has no problem with abortion or what, because it's the same kind of mentality. So that, or the exploitation of the poor, the exploitation of the rainforest and the exploitation of the poor is really the same thing. And so the crisis of our economy and our society and our environmental crisis is essentially the same thing. And the origin of it, as I said in the talk, is to be found there in part 1 of Let Us Dream, very clearly explained also in Laudato Si, which is the failure to acknowledge life and creation as a gift. So it becomes something that we use for our own benefit, rather than something that we cooperate with and contemplate and draw lessons from. And so integral ecology is the name that the Pope has given to this, I suppose you call it a new humanism, which is coming out of the church now, reflecting in the light of Catholic social principles on our multiple crises, and saying that the answer to this is in an integral ecology.
Well, thank you very much. You've mentioned several times, as Pope Francis does, the idea of gift. And I'd like to say it's been a gift to have a couple of hours with you, Austen, this morning. I think there's hundreds of people out there. I think there are people who couldn't get online because there were too many queuing up, as it were. But it's been a gift to have you here. We do wish you well, and hopefully your liaison and support of Pope Francis will continue for many more years. And I want to thank also Father Brito for his presence here, and also Paul Samuels at Peter and Paul, who's been behind all the technical things. So thank you, everyone. And you will tell your friends that this session, this talk, will be available on whatgoodnews.org, perhaps by Monday or Tuesday. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.